I'm assuming, yes, now we're recording. Okay, so today's Torah portion, or tomorrow's Torah portion, is Toldot, and it begins with, it begins actually in the middle or towards the end of chapter 25. And it is interesting, by the way, the Torah portion very often starts something and kind of divides something in the middle. And here I think it's actually very significant, because chapter 25 is really just a listing of children. Okay, so it begins with Abraham taking Keturah and their children, and then it talks about Ishmael and his children. And then with our Torah portion today, it begins with Isaac and the story of the birth of his children. But our sages, when they wanted to cut the portion, they did it so that the portion begins with the verse 19 to separate. Isaac is different. Okay, Abraham had children from different wives. In the end, he had actually children in the end from 3 different women, from Hagar, from Sarah, and from Keturah. But there's a division there. It's not the same. When we get to Isaac and his children, we are definitely talking about the one child, Isaac, who inherits Abraham. And in this Torah portion, we're going to start talking about who is the child who will inherit Isaac. And that, of course, is very significant. It begins at the very beginning. Actually, we're going to be discussing one of the main parts of this Torah portion, of course, is the blessings that Isaac is going to give to his 2 sons. He has in mind to give a particular set of blessings to Esau, and of course Rebekah and Jacob get together to trick Isaac and insert Jacob instead of Esau into that blessing. And all of this really is surrounding the subject, who is the firstborn? Not so much in the physical sense. At the very beginning of the Torah portion, we learn that these 2 boys are twins, and yet it is Esau who is born first. So he is clearly the physical firstborn. But the question that our Torah portion is dealing with today is, who is the firstborn in the sense of the heir of Isaac. And that's very interesting, by the way, the use of this idea of the firstborn, because firstborn is a fuss about a firstborn throughout the Bible. But in every situation that we're going to see throughout the book of Genesis, the physical firstborn never inherits. It is Isaac. Ishmael is older, but Isaac becomes the heir. And of course, in the case of Esau and Jacob, it is going to be Jacob who becomes the heir. And even when we look at Jacob's 12 children, all of whom, 12 sons, he has a daughter, but the 12 sons, all of whom inherit Jacob in the sense that they all become the nation of Israel, there's going to be one son that will designate it as the leader, and that is going to be Judah, not Reuben, even though Reuben is the technical firstborn. So this is just a theme that we're seeing throughout. But in this portion, more than any other portion, this issue of who is the firstborn, of course, is focused on and is really a very dramatic situation. So the 3 questions that I want to deal with as we're reviewing this Torah portion are, number 1, who should be the firstborn? Number 2, why is it that Rebekah did what she did? All right. And number 3, why didn't Rebekah discuss this with Isaac? Why couldn't she have sat down with Isaac and say, Isaac, dear one, I think you are picking the wrong fella, and you need to give the blessing to Jacob. Have a discussion. Parents often discuss about what they think is best for their children. And like any other family in a normative, open communication type of family, you have a discussion and you reach an agreement, and that's the end of that. She didn't even try to do that. She right away came up with this sort of manipulation. So those are the 3 things we're going to be focusing on, and we're going to start, of course, as we do every week. We're just going to read the scripture, we're going to read the verses, and we're going to see what kind of insights we can gain from what the scripture says itself. So at the beginning of the Torah portion, we learned that Rebekah is having trouble having children, and she, of course, is prayer involved. She gets pregnant. And while she's pregnant, she is feeling quite a great deal of distress as she feels a struggling going on inside her womb. And so she goes to seek God to get some kind of understanding what the heck is going in within her. And God speaks to her, which is actually a very important, significant event, because when God speaks to somebody, it means they are a prophet. It's not just something to be shoved aside. God doesn't speak to everybody. But in this case, he speaks to Rebecca and he gives her a prophecy. And what does he say? And this is in chapter 25, verse 23. 2 nations are in your womb. 2 separate peoples shall issue from your body. 1 people shall be mightier than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. And here we have 2 very significant points that are brought up. Number 1, that these 2 boys aren't just boys. They represent nations. Each of them will become separate nations. So already Rebecca's given to understand that only one of these boys can inherit Isaac, because only one can end up being that one nation that God promised to Abraham would inherit the land. You can't have 2 nations, despite what some governments think today. No, you can't have 2 nations in the one land of Israel. Only one, okay? So she already understands that there will be a separation in the children of Isaac, because they will represent 2 different nations. And the other thing is that the older shall serve the younger. So she already is told that the firstborn will not be the firstborn. The firstborn will be will have to serve the older, the firstborn will serve the younger. Okay, after they're born, that means that it is Esau who will serve Jacob. Now, she gets this prophecy. She never tells this prophecy to anybody. And that's in and itself a question. Did she tell anybody? I once had a teacher who suggested that you are not supposed to be retelling prophecies unless God specifically tells you to tell someone. In other words, very often, when Moses got word from God, God would say to him, so says, please say this to the children of Israel. But if it doesn't say that he said, and we see that also earlier when Abraham is told that he's going to have a son, later on, the angels come back and tell Abraham again in hearing of Sarah. So she hears it as well. Yet Abraham kind of knows this already. So it's like, how come he didn't tell her? And it's the same idea that God tells the person that he wants to tell, but it doesn't mean you're supposed to go chanting it all over town. Guess what God told me? And maybe that's a nice message for us to learn as well. But anyway, then we move on to verse 28, and we learn something about the relationship between the parents. Okay, Isaac favored Esau because he had a taste for game, but Rebekah favored Jacob. So right away we have here a situation that's not so great. Okay, parents are not supposed to favor children, but they did. And Isaac clearly favors, or he loves. Actually, the English that I have here says favors, but the word in Hebrew is vayehav, loved. Okay, Isaac loved Esau, Rebekah loved Jacob. It's not just they favored, they loved particularly this one child. And so that's a very powerful statement here that's going on. And of course, that sets the stage for what we're going to see later on. In verse 31, then we have this story of Esau coming in very tired, and Jacob has just made a stew, and he wants it. And Jacob immediately, these of course they're older already. Let's say they're teenagers or something, 17, 18 years old, something like that. And Jacob suddenly decides he's going to take advantage of this situation, and he's gonna say to Esau, okay, you want the stew, fine, but you've got to sell me the birthright. Now, there are people who will say, oh, that's not fair. He was so hungry. He was tired. He took advantage of Esau at a moment of weakness. It's a manipulation. But let's take a look at what happens at the end. At the very end, in verse 34, it says, Jacob then gave Esau bread and lentil soup. He ate and drank, and he rose and went away. Thus did Esau spurn the birthright. Okay, so what scripture is telling us is that Esau made it after he had eaten, he was satiated. He didn't at that point say, oh, you know what, I can't believe I did this. And in legal situations, it would have been perfectly legitimate to say, you exerted undue influence over me to get me to sign this over to you. As soon as I, got myself back to normal, I immediately reject it. And then you have a case to stand on. But immediately after Esau is satiated, he says, we know right away, he spurns the birthright. He didn't care about it anyway. So at this point in time, yes, you can say that Jacob took advantage of a situation, but he did not manipulate Esau against his will, because his will is already very much clarified for us at the very end of the story. By the way, I think that if Jacob is initially introduced to us in verse 27 as a simple man, a pure man, ishtam, it could be simple, it could be pure, certainly not the kind of person who usually thinks of ways to outsmart somebody else or to come up with tricks. So in that sense, this taking advantage of the situation is a new thing for Jacob, but it also paves the way for a certain type of personality he has no choice but to develop if he's going to deal with Laban. And frankly, the way I look at it, this is a prototype for the nation of Israel. We have never been able to just be simple and naive, because if we do so, we do that at our peril. And the only way we as a nation have been able to survive all these centuries of anti-Semitism without our own country, I'm not talking about where we are today, but all those centuries of dispersion without our own country, if we didn't know how to take advantage of an opportunity and figure out ways to outsmart our enemies, we would have been long gone. But that's just an aside. Okay, the next thing, we're going to skip the chapter 26 because it's a side story to what we're talking about. But chapter 27 begins with the story of how the blessings get taken from Esau and given to Jacob. But actually, the story really begins 2 verses earlier. In the end of chapter 26, the last 2 verses read as follows. When Esau was 40 years old, he took to wife Judith, daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and Basmat, daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they were a source of bitterness to Isaac and Rebekah. And why do I say this is where the story starts? Because if we pay attention, there's actually a framework to this story. The beginning of the story, we have a story of Esau's marriage. He takes 2 Canaanite Hittites, or Canaanite, 2 Canaanite women as his wife, and these become a source of bitterness to his parents. And if you remember, Abraham went out of his way to ensure that Isaac would not marry the Canaanite women, and he sent Eliezer all the way to Haran to get a wife from the family. Okay, and here Jacob is still unmarried, but Esau is already taken up with the Canaanite women, which is something that is very disturbing to them. The very end of the story, we will see, and this is why I think it is the framework for the story. At the very end of the story, we have, this is chapter 28, verse 8, and Esau realized that the Canaanite women displeased his father Isaac. So Esau went to Ishmael and took to wife, in addition to the wives he had, Mahlat, the daughter of Ishmael, son of Abraham, sister of Nebayot. So if the story begins with Esau taking these women that are clearly displeasing to his parents, at the end of this whole story, something in Esau changes and he realizes he really messed up. And he is going to try to win his way back into his father's favor by taking a wife from the family. He's taking a wife from the family of Ishmael. Okay. Now, and then we come into the story itself in chapter 27, and we learn that Isaac is old and that his eyes have become dim. Last week, we discussed this as a possible interpretation. What happened was the consequences to Isaac of the binding of the binding, and we offered one of the interpretations that the experience of the binding created a spiritual eye-opening experience, but at the same time created a certain blindness to realities. Okay, Isaac becomes someone that is far more tuned to spirituality than he is to reality. And while we saw in the chapter we skipped, by the way, chapter 26 is a chapter that shows that actually Isaac is quite a good businessman. But I think certainly by the time we reach chapter 27, he's an older man. He is certainly as it comes to his son, he is not seeing reality for what it is. By the way, we are already told, in addition to the verses we just saw at the end of chapter 26, something about Esau's real character, in case we are saying to ourselves, well, Isaac was right, Esau was really a good guy. Scripture itself, as the neutral narrator, tells us something about Esau right before in the wives he has chosen and who are of great distress to his parents. But later on, we learn more about these wives. In verse 35, we learn, in verse 46, we learn from Rebekah's perspective when she says to Isaac, I am disgusted with my life because of the Hittite women. If Jacob marries a Hittite woman like these from among the native women, what good will life be to me? It's not just that they are distressing to his parents, but Rebekah even goes so far as to sound almost suicidal. These women are so bad. And I think that also tells us something. It's not just about the character of Esau. There are many men out there that make bad choices when it comes to men. And there's women who make men make bad choices about women. And there's women who make bad choices about men. But in this case, I think we're also seeing that if we're talking about who will be the heir to Isaac, who will be the heir, the mother of his children becomes particularly critical, because it's not just who he marries, it's who will be raising the children, who will in turn be the next generation to inherit that promise. So this becomes far more important than relationships between a daughter-in-law and her in-laws. Okay, so in the end of the day, if we're asking ourselves, why is it that Rebekah did what she did? Why did she feel? I think, first of all, we answer the first question, who should be the firstborn? I think we're already seeing problems with Esau, okay? If we're asking why Rebekah did what she did, we can already see how she perceives her son, she perceives the wives that he has chosen, but even more than that, she has received a prophecy, okay? The prophecy is very specific. It talked about two nations that will have to be divided. And it talks about the fact that the older will serve the younger. And therefore, she's been given already a prophecy from God before these boys were ever born that strengthens her understanding that it is Jacob who must receive the prophecy, receive the blessing, not Esau. And one of the things that, if I'm going to, let's say, talk about Isaac, well, why isn't Isaac seeing this? What is really going on here? I would say two statements. I would say love is blind and Isaac is blind, okay? We learn from scripture that Isaac loves Esau. This is a blind love. I mean, it says already right before the start, right before our current chapter, it says that these wives are distressed to both Isaac and Rebekah. So Isaac is seeing the same thing Rebekah is seeing about these wives, but he is so blinded in his love for Esau that he's not able to understand something about Esau's character that he needs to understand. And he's not able to understand what ramifications of that issue, of the family issue here, that will, of course, affect Esau's ability to become the heir. But then, of course, we have Isaac is blind, and that we discussed. He is not able to see the reality of his sons and which of them would be more suited for this blessing. Okay, now, what actually happens at the end? I mean, I'm not going to hold through the whole story. I'm sure you know the story about how, Rivka puts Jacob up to dressing like Esau, disguising his voice, going into Isaac, pretending he's Esau. It's quite a problematic story. And I'm going to get back to the fact that, like, what is it that, why did Rebecca not discuss this with Isaac? But first, I want to take a look at what actually happens. You know what? No, I'm switching it. I want to address this question first and then move on. The question, of course, is why is it that Rebecca didn't discuss it with Isaac? And I think in many ways, we can go back to the same thing. The love is blind and Isaac is blind. If you think about parents, I don't know, just take, for example, we've all gone through this. Most of us, I think, have at least been parents, grandparents, and some of you, not me, are great-grandparents. But think about how you feel when somebody criticizes your child. When the teacher calls to say, your child is really a snake. Now, it's one thing if the teacher calls and says, your child didn't do his homework. Okay, didn't do his homework. You have to make sure he does his homework. But if a teacher were to call you and say, your child lied, your child is violent, if there would be something the teacher says to you about your child that reflects on his character, that is already a very difficult thing to accept. And most parents will have a very hard time accepting it. They're blind to the realities of their children. Most of us are at some level, and it requires a certain degree of stepping outside your bias in order to see what your child is really like. And I would hope that in most cases, you are able to see what your child is really like, not to condemn them, but to help them become better people, okay? But of course, in this case, in biblical stories, it's a much more archetypal kind of story, so you don't have that thing playing out, okay? But in this case, I think we must understand or believe that Rebecca would never have been successful if she had gone to Isaac, who she knew had this blind spot for Esau, going to tell him, you can't give the blessing to Esau, would never have worked, and would have just caused discord, and it would probably, he would have given the blessing to Esau anyway, because he would have done what he thinks is right. So I have to believe that this is what Rebecca was doing. Is that the best way to handle it? I don't know. I would say that we would all hope that they would have had a better relationship, that she would have been able to help him to see this. But we can't undo what was done, and we don't have enough of that insight. But this is how I assume, that I can justify what she did. So now I want to go on to see what were the actual ramifications of this switch. What was it that Isaac was trying to do? And if you look carefully in terms of the blessings, what blessings was Isaac trying to give to Esau, and what blessings was he going to give to Jacob anyway? And we actually have that spelled out for us fairly clearly in the scripture. If you look at chapter 27, verse 28 through 29, these are the blessings that Isaac gives to Jacob, thinking that he's Esau. So this is clearly the blessing he plans to give to Esau. And we read as follows. May God give you of the dew of heaven and the fat of the earth, abundance of new grain and wine. Let peoples serve you and nations bow to you. Be master over your brothers, and let your mother's sons bow to you. Cursed be who curse you, blessed they who bless you. Now, if we pay attention to this blessing, we will find echoes to two other blessings. One, we find a very definite echo to God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 12:3. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. This is exactly the same blessing that Isaac is giving to Esau. In his mind, he's giving it to Esau, okay? We also have echoes of the blessing that Jacob will give to Judah later on. In chapter 49, we'll probably get to this later on, but just, you don't have to move there if you don't want to, but chapter 49, verse 8, Jacob's blessing to Judah. He says, you, O Judah, your brothers shall praise, your hand shall be on the nape of your foes. Your father's sons shall bow low to you. Okay? Your father's son shall bow low to you. So it talks about, on the one thing, that his brothers will be will serve him, Judah, and it talks about him having the upper hand against his enemies. So we have echoes of that here when it says, let people serve you and nations bow to you, be a master over your brothers, and let your mother's sons bow to you. So we have echoes of both of these things in this blessing to Esau. We have here also echoes of the original prophecy that Rebekah heard from God, that it was the younger who would serve the older. In these blessings, we have your brothers serving you. So clearly, what we have here is Isaac wanting to give elements of the blessing that God had given to Abraham, okay, and elements of the promise that was given to Rebekah, giving these to Esau, and these are blessings that in fact will be passed on to Judah, who is the reigning brother of the sons of Jacob. So if it is Esau, it is Jacob who will be the sole heir to Isaac. Esau cannot get these blessings. Because, but now let's look for a second at what Isaac did not give to Jacob as Esau. At the very end, when Jacob takes his leave of his father blesses him again. And he says, verse 28. No, not there. Why am I not seeing it? 1 second. He gives him, oh, here it is. He gives him, this is chapter 28, verse 4. May he grant the blessing of Abraham to you and your offspring, that you may possess the land where you are sojourning, which God assigned to Abraham. This is the blessing of Abraham. The blessing of Abraham is the first promise, the promise that God gave to Abraham once he was in the land. I will give this land to your children. The blessing of the children and the blessing of the land. This is the blessing of Abraham. What we see from here then is that in Isaac's mind, he was dividing the blessing. He was giving the dominion over the brothers and over enemies to Esau, but he was giving the land and the children to Jacob. But we know from the way Jacob blessed Judah, and we know from the way God promised Rebekah and what God promised to Abraham, those blessings cannot be split. They have to go to the one and only heir. And this is where Esau made the mistake, and this is where Rebekah understood that she needed to correct this in order to ensure that the prophecy that she received and the blessing that was given to Abraham is passed on as it needs to do. Now, where do we see one more verse that I wanted to just point out is chapter 26, verse 3. We will notice that Abraham never blesses Isaac. Okay, God blesses Abraham, and Isaac blesses Jacob, and Jacob blesses his sons. But there's a missing link in there. Okay, Abraham doesn't bless Isaac. Instead, God blesses Isaac. Chapter 26, verse 3. Reside in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. I will assign all these lands to you and to your heirs, fulfilling the oath that I swore to Abraham. I will make your heirs as numerous as the stars of heaven, and assign your heirs all these lands, so that all the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your heirs. Okay? This is something that also is echoing of God's promise to Abraham that his children will be a blessing for all the nations of the world. So this then is the blessing of Abraham, the children, the land, and the fact that the children of Israel will be a source of blessing for the entire world. This is handed to Isaac by Abraham. But this extra addition that is only added once God speaks to Rebekah, that the older will serve the younger, this becomes apparent only because there are twins. And it could very easily be that they both have the same father, they both have the same mother, and Isaac's way of thinking made sense. We need to split the blessing between the two twins. It required a prophecy from God to make it very clear that the promise of Abraham, the entire promise to Abraham, all of its parts, including the prophecy to Rebekah that said, it is the older who will serve the younger, that had to only go to one son, and that son was Jacob. It was wonderful being with you today. I hope you enjoyed our lesson today. I look forward to seeing you again next week at the same time.